They say that history is written by the survivors. But what happens when history simply looks away? We all know the story of the great ship that struck the ice, the band that played on, the long, slow tragedy of the Titanic. But there is another story, a darker story, one that lies buried not in the deep Atlantic but in the cold, rushing mud of a river we think we know. This is the story of a ship that was built to be safer than the Titanic. She carried enough lifeboats for everyone. She was a masterpiece of steel and steam, a floating palace designed to bridge the old world and the new. But physics does not care about luxury, and the river does not care about rules. On a calm night in May, amidst the silence of a sudden fog, the unthinkable became the inevitable. She didn't take hours to die. She took 14 minutes. 14 minutes to turn a grand ambition into a tomb for over 1,000 souls. Why have we forgotten her? Was it the war that followed, or is the truth of what happened that night simply too terrifying to remember? Tonight we are going to peel back the layers of a century of silence. We are going to descend into the dark water to reconstruct the moments where engineering met fate. So turn down the lights, settle into your favorite chair, and let's bring this forgotten ghost back to the surface. Welcome to the investigation. There are places on this earth where the water does not behave like water. It behaves like memory. It holds on to things. It swallows light and sound and history, and it keeps them, suspended in the cold, dark pressure of the deep. The St. Lawrence River is one of those places. It is an artery of commerce, a gateway to a continent, and a graveyard that is ancient, indifferent, and vast. On a late afternoon in May in the year 1914, the river looked deceptively calm. It was a canvas of slate grey and steel blue, moving with that heavy, muscular current that suggests immense power hidden just beneath the surface. The air was crisp, carrying the last biting remnants of a Canadian winter, mixing with the smell of coal smoke and salt. If you stood on the docks of Quebec City that day, you would have seen her, the Empress of Ireland. She was not the largest ship in the world. She did not possess the sheer, arrogant scale of the Titanic, which had vanished into the Atlantic only 2 years prior. But she was magnificent in her own right. She was a liner built for reliability, for speed, and for the specific dangerous rhythm of the North Atlantic run. She sat high in the water, her hull painted a clean, sharp white, her 2 buff funnels rising like industrial cathedrals against the skyline. She was a Royal Mail ship, a designation that carried weight. It meant schedule. It meant precision. It meant that the British Empire, in all its fading Victorian glory, trusted this vessel to carry its words, its orders, and its people across the ocean. She was 8 years old. In the life of a ship, that is the prime of existence. She was broken in, tested, familiar to her crew. She was not an experiment. She was a machine that worked. As the sun began to dip low, casting long, bruised shadows across the water, the Empress prepared to leave the safety of the harbour. There is a specific energy to a departure. It is a mixture of relief and anxiety. For the passengers, it is the start of an adventure or the end of a struggle. For the crew, it is the beginning of the shift. The machinery wakes up. The boilers, deep in the belly of the ship, begin to roar with a hunger for coal. There were nearly 1,500 souls on board. Take a moment to visualize that number, not as a statistic but as a crowd, a village. There were wealthy industrialists in first class, sipping sherry in rooms paneled with mahogany and lit by electric chandeliers. There were members of the Salvation Army Band, over 100 of them, carrying their brass instruments, their Bibles and their faith, heading to a congress in London. And there were the others, the hundreds in third class, the immigrants who had tried to find a new life in Canada and were now going home, or those just arriving to visit the old country. They were packed into the lower decks, sleeping in bunks that vibrated with the hum of the propeller shafts. They felt safe. And why wouldn't they? The tragedy of the Titanic had changed the world. It had rewritten the rulebook. The Empress of Ireland carried enough lifeboats for everyone on board. She had wireless telegraphy. She had watertight bulkheads, those great steel walls designed to seal off the ship in the event of a disaster. She was designed to float, even if 2 of her massive compartments were flooded. The mathematics of her survival had been calculated, checked and stamped with approval. As the lines were cast off and the tugboats nudged her away from the pier, the mood was light. The Salvation Army band played hymns on the deck. God be with you till we meet again. The music drifted over the water, bouncing off the warehouses and the hills, a sound that was sweet and melancholy. But as the ship turned her bow downstream, toward the widening mouth of the river and the open ocean beyond, she was moving into a trap. It was not a trap set by malice. It was a trap set by geography, by physics, and by the cruel, blind nature of the elements. Leading this floating city was Captain Henry Kendall. Kendall was a man of the new century. He was not a cowboy of the seas. He was a professional. He was disciplined, meticulous, and experienced. He had risen through the ranks not by taking wild risks, but by adhering to the doctrine of the merchant navy. He understood the rules of the road. He respected the sea. This was his first voyage in command of the Empress down this river, but he knew the route. He knew the ship. He stood on the bridge, surrounded by the latest navigation technology of 1914. He had officers, lookouts, quartermasters. He had a system, and the system was designed to eliminate error. As the Empress steamed past the lights of the shore, gaining speed, pushing through the water at 18 knots, the night settled in. The passengers retired to their cabins. The stewards turned down the beds. The lights in the public rooms were dimmed. The ship became a sleeping organism, breathing in the rhythm of the engines. Down below, the firemen shoveled coal into the furnaces. They were the heartbeat of the ship, working in heat that would blister the skin of a normal man. They were stripped to the waist, covered in grime, feeding the beast that drove them forward. They trusted the officers on the bridge. The officers on the bridge trusted the engineers below. It was a chain of faith, forged in steel. But the St. Lawrence River has a weapon that no engineer can design against: fog. It didn't roll in like a wall. It formed. It materialized out of the air itself, a reaction between the warm, moist air of a spring day and the frigid water of the river. It started as wisps low on the water, like ghosts skimming the surface. Then it thickened. It rose. It blotted out the stars. It erased the horizon. On the bridge, Captain Kendall saw it coming. He watched the shore lights dim and vanish. He watched the bow of his own ship blur into a grey nothingness. He did exactly what he was supposed to do. He was a prudent man. He checked his speed. He ordered the engines to stand by. He began to sound the whistle. That sound, a deep, mournful bass note. It vibrates in the chest. In the fog, sound does strange things. It bends, it echoes. It can seem to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Kendall knew he wasn't alone on the river. Before the fog had closed in completely, he had seen the lights of another ship, a vessel coming upriver heading toward Quebec. She was the Storstad. The Storstad was not a liner. She was not a palace of mahogany and electric light. She was a collier, a coal carrier. She was built for function, not comfort. She was low in the water, heavy, jagged, and hard. Her hull was reinforced to carry thousands of tons of rock. She was a hammer floating on the current. The Storstad was Norwegian. Her captain and her crew were capable men. They too saw the fog. They too saw the lights of the Empress before the grey curtain fell. This is where the tragedy moves from geography to geometry. Two ships, two captains, both rational, both experienced, both following the rules. They were moving on the river like two dancers in a darkroom. They had seen each other. They had established a mental map of where the other was. Kendall believed the Storstad was passing to his starboard. Green light to green light. Safe. Routine. The Storstad's officers believed the Empress was passing to their port. Red to red. The fog swallowed them both. Now they were flying blind. They relied on the whistles. One blast, I am keeping my course. Two blasts, I have stopped my engines. But the river currents are tricky here. They twist and turn. A ship can be pointing one way but moving another. And in the silence of the fog, amidst the echo of the whistles, a fatal misunderstanding took root. Kendall, on the high bridge of the Empress, peered into the gloom. He felt the dampness on his face. He strained his eyes, looking for the masthead lights of the other ship. He was cautious. He had brought his massive ship to a near halt, waiting for the other vessel to pass safely by. He was playing it safe. He was doing everything right. On the Storstad, the chief officer was in command. He saw the lights of the Empress disappear into the mist. He thought she was further away. He thought she was moving faster. He made a small adjustment to his helm, just a small one, a correction. In the scale of the ocean, a small correction is nothing. In the tight channel of the river, in the blindness of the fog, a small correction is a death sentence. It was almost 2 o'clock in the morning, the witching hour, the time when the human body is in its deepest cycle of sleep. Inside the Empress, the corridors were quiet. Shoes had been left outside cabin doors to be polished. Children were asleep with their toys. Husbands and wives lay side by side in the narrow bunks. The third-class passengers, the ones who had saved every penny for this passage, were sleeping in the forward sections of the ship, closest to the waterline. They were dreaming of Liverpool, of London, of the homes they had left behind or the ones they were returning to. They were suspended in that liminal space between continents, trusting that the morning would bring sunlight and breakfast. Suddenly, out of the grey wool of the night, something emerged. It wasn't a shape at first. It was a shadow, a darkening of the fog. Captain Kendall saw it. He grabbed the megaphone. He didn't just speak. He roared. He shouted into the void, a desperate command to a ship that was already too close to hear him. Full speed astern. He ordered his own engines to reverse. He tried to back away. He tried to pull his massive floating city out of the path of the hammer. The vibration of the engines changing direction shuddered through the ship. It woke some people. A change in the hum, a rattle of a glass on a bedside table. But for most, it was just a noise in the night. Then came the lights. The Storstad emerged from the fog like a monster rising from the deep. Her bow was sharp, reinforced steel, designed to break through ice. She was fully loaded with coal. She possessed an incredible amount of kinetic energy, momentum. She was not moving fast, maybe 10 knots, but 10 knots with that much mass is unstoppable. The collision, when it came, was not like the movies. It was not a fiery explosion. It was not a thunderclap that shattered the sky. It was a sickening, grinding crunch. The Storstad struck the Empress of Ireland amidships, right in the soft underbelly. She hit between the two funnels, slicing through the steel plating as if it were paper. The sound was terrible, but it was muffled by the fog and the water. It was the sound of metal screaming, of rivets popping like gunshots, of wood splintering. The Storstad didn't just hit and bounce off. She drove herself into the side of the liner. Her bow penetrated deep into the hull, tearing through cabins, through corridors, and into the boiler rooms. For a moment the two ships were locked together, a fatal embrace. Captain Kendall, on the wing of the bridge, watched in horror. He shouted to the Storstad to keep her engines going, to keep pushing against the wound, to act as a plug. If she stayed there, she might stop the water from rushing in. But physics is a cruel master. The momentum of the Empress, still drifting forward, and the rebound of the collision swung the ships apart. The Storstad pulled back, and with that separation the wound was opened. It was a hole the size of a garage door, and it was wide open to the river. The water did not trickle in, it did not seep, it roared. Imagine the St. Lawrence River, cold, dark, infinite. Now imagine that river being given a sudden, violent path into a warm, lit space. The water hit the boilers. It hit the coal bunkers. It hit the sleeping quarters of the third-class passengers. It was an invasion. The speed of the intake was catastrophic. Gallons per second, tons per minute. The ship didn't just take on water. She inhaled it. The Empress shuddered. It was a mortal wound, and the ship seemed to know it instantly. She began to list, to lean, to the right, to starboard. This is the moment where the confidence of the Edwardian era died. The watertight compartments, the ones that were supposed to save her, were rendered useless. The damage was across the bulkheads, not between them. And the list, the tilt, happened so fast that the water simply spilled over the tops of the walls that were meant to contain it. In the cabins, the world tilted. Passengers woke up sliding. They woke up to the sound of water rushing in the corridors. They woke up to darkness because the water was killing the dynamos. There was no time for confusion. There was only time for terror. Those in the lower decks, the immigrants, the families, they didn't even have the chance to reach the stairs. The water was already there. It was cold enough to stop your breath. It was black with coal dust. It swirled with debris, suitcases, mattresses, shoes. On the bridge, Captain Kendall looked at the inclinometer. The ship was leaning. 5 degrees, 10 degrees. He knew. In that split second, he knew. This wasn't a crisis. This was an execution. He ordered the lifeboats swinging out. He ordered the distress signal. SOS, SOS, have been struck. Sinking. The wireless operator, tapping out the code in a room that was already tilting at a crazy angle, sent the plea out into the fog. But the fog swallows sound, and the river swallows everything else. The Empress of Ireland was a masterpiece of engineering. She was built of steel and rivet, of sweat and science. She was a testament to man's conquest of nature, and she had been killed in seconds. The water rushed into the starboard side, weighing it down, pulling her over. The laws of buoyancy were being rewritten by the laws of gravity. As the passengers scrambled from their bunks, groping in the dim light, trying to understand why the floor was becoming a wall, they were not fighting a villain. They were fighting the river, and the river was winning. This was not a slow sinking. This was a capsize. The ship was rolling over. Think of the interior of a great hotel, the long corridors, the grand staircases. Now, tilt that hotel on its side. The floor becomes a cliff. The wall becomes a floor. The door to your room, once an exit, is now a trapdoor in the ceiling that you cannot reach. This was the geometry of doom. And it was happening in the dark, in the fog, in silence broken only by the screams of the waking and the roar of the water. This is how it begins, not with a battle, but with a mistake, a moment of blindness, a calculation that missed by inches. The Empress was dying, and she had 14 minutes left to live. 14 minutes, that is the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee, to read a newspaper article, to walk a mile. For the 1,477 people on board, it was the entirety of the rest of their lives. The lights flickered, the steam vented with a deafening shriek, the angle increased, and the river poured in, cold and heavy, claiming its prize. This is the story of those 14 minutes, the story of the grand ambition and how it sank beneath the surface of the St. Lawrence, leaving nothing but ripples in the fog. When the river entered the ship, it did not negotiate. It did not ask for permission. It simply took the space it was owed. The laws of physics are absolute in this way. If you open a hole in a steel box floating in water, the water will enter until the pressures are equalized. And for the Empress of Ireland, equalization meant the bottom of the river. The ship was now fighting a battle on 2 fronts. There was the water rushing in, heavy and cold, filling the starboard side, and there was the air, trapped and compressed, trying to escape. You have to understand the geometry of this nightmare. A ship is designed to be level. Every staircase, every doorframe, every corridor is built on the assumption that down is beneath your feet. But within 60 seconds of the collision, down had moved. The list, the tilt of the ship, began immediately. It wasn't a gentle sway, like a liner rolling in a heavy swell. It was a lurch, a stumble. The ship felt heavy, sluggish. She lost that vibrant, living hum of a vessel under command and took on the dead weight of a drowning thing. Deep in the belly of the beast, the engineers were the first to understand the math of their own deaths. These were men of the machine age. They lived in a world of oil, steam, and heat. They knew the ship better than the captain. They knew the temper of the boilers and the rhythm of the pistons. When the Storstad's bow sliced into the hull, it opened the bunkers where the coal was stored. It opened the boiler rooms. Imagine standing in a cathedral of steel, surrounded by furnaces burning at thousands of degrees. And then, a wall of water, freezing cold, slams into that heat. The steam explosion alone would have been blinding, the hissing shriek of water hitting fire. The air turned instantly into a scalding fog. But these men did not run, not immediately. They tried to close the watertight doors. The ship was equipped with them, massive vertical plates of steel designed to drop down and seal the compartments. They were the fail-safes, the guarantee of safety. But the system was hydraulic or manual, and it required time. It required balance. As the ship listed to the right, the gravity that helped these doors close began to work against them. Friction increased in the tracks. The water rushed over the sills before the doors could seat. In the number 2 boiler room, the water rose so fast it caught men at their stations. They were waist-deep, then chest-deep in seconds. The lights flickered. The dynamos were struggling as the steam pressure dropped and the water shorted the circuits. In this strobe-lit hell, men scrambled up steel ladders that were suddenly tilted at crazy angles. The rungs were slick with oil and condensation. And as the ship rolled, the ladders became overhangs. To climb up was to climb an inverted slope. They died in the darkness, their hands grasping for hatches that had already been sealed from above, or washed away by a torrent that carried the weight of the St. Lawrence. Above them, on the passenger decks, the horror was different. It was the horror of disorientation. Sleep is a vulnerable state. You are defenseless. Your mind is elsewhere. When the crash came, it was a dull thud for many, barely enough to wake them. But the list, the rolling of the world, that woke everyone. Imagine waking up in a pitch-black room. You try to stand, but the floor throws you against the wall. You reach for the light switch, but the power is dying, the bulb glowing a dim, dying orange before fading to black. You hear sounds you don't understand, wood groaning under immense stress, glass shattering, and beneath it all, the sound of water, rushing, gurgling. In the third-class cabins, located deep in the forward part of the ship, the situation was immediate and catastrophic. These cabins were small, packed tight, whole families in a single room. The corridors here were narrow, a labyrinth of turns designed to maximize space for bunks. When the water breached the hull, it didn't just fill the rooms, it pressurized the air. Doors slammed shut, or they jammed in their frames as the steel of the hull twisted. People pushed against doors that wouldn't open. They battered their fists against wood that was held fast by the warping of the ship's skeleton. The water rose around their ankles, then their knees. There was no time for goodbyes, no time for prayers. For hundreds of people in the lower decks, the disaster lasted only minutes. They were trapped in steel boxes that became tombs, the water rising until there was no air left to breathe. Higher up, in first and second class, there was a cruel illusion of a chance. These passengers had further to go to reach the water, but the water was coming to meet them. They stumbled out of their cabins into the long corridors of the upper decks. But the corridors had changed. A ship listing at 20 degrees is difficult to walk on. At 30 degrees, it is impossible without holding on. At 40 degrees, the floor is a slide. The beautifully polished linoleum, the thick carpets, they became treacherous. People slipped. They fell. They slid across the width of the ship, slamming into the walls on the low side, piling up in heaps of bruised limbs and terrified confusion. And the sound. It wasn't just screaming. It was the sound of the ship itself dying. Objects began to move. Heavy suitcases slid across rooms. Pianos in the lounge broke free of their lashings and crashed through partitions. Crockery in the galley smashed in a cacophony of destruction. It was a landslide of domestic objects, a chaotic avalanche of the mundane. In the darkness, voices lost their direction. "Where are the stairs? Help me! This way!" But this way was changing every second. The stairs that led up to the boat deck were now steep climbs. The railings were hard to grip. Old men, children, women in nightgowns. They tried to haul themselves up the incline, fighting gravity, fighting the panic of the crowd. The psychological terror of the list cannot be overstated. We rely on the horizon. We rely on the ground being flat. When the world tilts, the inner ear rebels. You feel dizzy, nauseous. You cannot think straight. And all the while, the angle increased. 30 degrees, 40 degrees. The lights went out completely. Now the only light came from the few emergency flares struck on the deck, and the distant, uncaring moon trying to pierce the fog. Inside the ship, it was absolute, suffocating blackness. People crawled over the bodies of the fallen. They felt their way along the walls. They followed the draft of fresh air, hoping it led to the outside. Some found themselves in dead ends, corridors that dipped down into the water. They turned back only to find the crowd behind them pushing forward, a wall of humanity driven by instinct. It was a crush, a panic in a bottleneck, and the water kept rising. On the boat deck, the highest point of the ship, the crew was trying to perform a miracle. Maritime regulations required lifeboats. The Empress had them, plenty of them. But regulations assume a ship will stay relatively flat. They assume you will have time. The Empress was rolling onto her side so fast that the port side lifeboats, the ones on the high side, the left side, were becoming useless. As the ship tilted, these boats swung inward, crashing against the superstructure. They couldn't be lowered. They hung there. Heavy wooden whaleboats, tantalizingly close but utterly impossible to launch. The crew struggled with the davits. They hacked at the ropes with axes. They put their shoulders against the wood, trying to push the boats out over the side. But gravity was an enemy they couldn't defeat. The boats were pinned. On the starboard side, the low side, the right side, the situation was different, but equally deadly. Here the boats swung out too far. They dangled over the rushing water, banging against the hull, which was now leaning away from them. The crew managed to lower a few. Number 1, number 3, number 5. But the angle was so steep that the boats scraped down the side of the ship. Rivets caught the wood, planking splintered, and as the ship rolled further, the water got closer. The ocean didn't wait for the boats to be lowered. It rose up to meet them. Some boats were launched only to be immediately crushed by the listing hull. Others were swamped the moment they hit the water. Chaos reigned. There was no women and children first, in the orderly, mythic sense of the Titanic. There was no time for chivalry to be organized. There were moments of individual heroism, yes. A husband passing his wife into a boat, a sailor grabbing a child. But mostly it was a scramble, a desperate, clawing fight for a seat in a wooden shell. And then, the davits themselves began to fail. The heavy iron arms that held the boats twisted under the strain. Cables snapped. Boats fell, dropping onto the people swimming in the water below, crushing them. It was a machinery of salvation, turning into a machinery of slaughter. Captain Kendall was still on the bridge, or what was left of it. The bridge is the brain of the ship. But the brain had been severed from the body. The wheel no longer turned the rudder. The telegraphs no longer sent orders to the engine room. Kendall watched his command dissolve. He saw the water creeping up the deck. He saw the funnel, that massive smokestack looming over him, leaning further and further. He knew what was coming next. The funnels were held in place by stay wires, but as the ship rolled, the strain on these wires became immense. With a sound like a cannon shot, a wire snapped, then another. The giant steel cylinder, tons of metal, toppled. It crashed into the water, crushing a lifeboat that had just managed to launch. It smashed the people in the water. It created a massive wave that swamped everything nearby. The Empress was breaking apart, not from an explosion, but from the violence of her own death throes. Let's talk about time again. 5 minutes had passed, maybe 7. In 7 minutes, a city had been turned into a wreck. 7 minutes. The time it takes to listen to 2 songs. For the passengers trapped inside, those 7 minutes stretched into an eternity. Imagine being in the dining saloon. The tables are bolted to the floor, but the chairs are not. The piano is sliding. The water is pouring in through the portholes that were left open for fresh air. Another fatal detail. The water didn't just come from below. It came from the side. As the ship rolled, the open portholes on the lower decks dipped below the surface. Hundreds of 12-inch holes became hundreds of new leaks. The river poured in, accelerating the list. The ship was drinking the river through every orifice. At 10 minutes, the list was so severe that the port side of the hull, the bottom of the ship, was rising out of the water. People who had made it to the deck were now standing on the side of the ship. They were walking on the steel plating of the hull, which was slippery with slime and algae. They looked down into the black water. It was a chaotic soup of debris, deck chairs, crates, bodies, and the few lifeboats that were floating, overcrowded, spinning in the eddies. The fog still hung over everything, a shroud. It muffled the cries. It made the scene feel unreal, like a nightmare occurring in a cloud. You couldn't see the shore. You couldn't see the stars. You could only see the ship disappearing beneath you. At 12 minutes, the Empress gave up. She stopped fighting. She simply let go. The stern rose slightly. The bow dipped. She rolled completely onto her starboard side. For a moment, she lay there. A wounded animal resting its head. The vibrations stopped. The grinding stopped. There was a terrible, brief silence before the final plunge. Those clinging to the high side of the hull, the port side, were now stranded on an island of steel that was rapidly sinking. They had to make a choice: stay on the ship and be sucked down with her, or jump. Jumping into the Saint. Lawrence in May is not like jumping into a swimming pool. The water is barely above freezing. When you hit that water, the shock is instant. It punches the air out of your lungs. Your heart stutters. Your muscles seize. It is called cold shock response. It kills you long before hypothermia does. It makes you inhale, and if your head is underwater when you inhale, you drown. Hundreds jumped. They leaped from the railings, from the hull into the dark. They landed on each other. They landed on debris. They landed in the water and gasped, swallowing the river. Captain Kendall was washed off the bridge. He was wearing his lifebelt. He floated in the icy water, watching his ship die. He saw the lights, the emergency lights, finally blink out. The ship was now a shadow against the slightly lighter grey of the fog. 13 minutes. The air inside the ship was venting. Great geysers of bubbles, of trapped atmosphere, burst to the surface. It was the ship's last breath. The suction began. As a mass that large goes down, it pulls the water with it. It creates a vortex. The swimmers felt it. A tug. An invisible hand grabbing their ankles, pulling them down. Those in the lifeboats rowed frantically, trying to put distance between themselves and the sinking giant. They pulled on the oars, their hands bleeding, their eyes fixed on the spot where the Empress was vanishing. 14 minutes. That is all it took. The Empress of Ireland, the pride of the Canadian Pacific Line, the bridge between nations, slipped beneath the surface. She didn't go down with a roar, she went down with a gurgle, a heavy final sigh, and then the river closed over her. The water smoothed out, the ripples expanded and faded. Where there had been a ship, there was now only wreckage and silence. The fog remained, indifferent, thick. The people in the water were now alone. There were hundreds of them bobbing in the freezing current. Calls for help, screams of names. "Mother! John! Help me!" But the ship was gone. The machine had failed. The engineering had been defeated by the angle of the blow and the speed of the water. All that was left was the human element, the biological struggle to keep the head above the surface, to fight the cold, to hold onto a piece of wood. The drama of the steel and steam was over. The drama of flesh and blood had just begun. 14 minutes, it was an erasure, a deletion. One moment a civilization, the next a memory. The Storstad, the ship that had dealt the death blow, was floating nearby, damaged but afloat. Her crew listened to the screams in the fog. They lowered their own boats, but they were slow, they were confused. The river, massive and cold, flowed on toward the sea, carrying the debris, the bodies and the secrets of the Empress downstream. Down in the wreck, which was now settling into the mud of the riverbed 130 feet below, the clocks on the walls ticked for a few more seconds before the water pressure stopped their mechanisms. They stopped at roughly 2:10 a.m., a timestamp on a tombstone. The grand ambition was over. The reality of the river had taken everything. The river had taken the ship, but it was not finished with the people. When a vessel of that size vanishes, it leaves a scar on the surface of the water, a chaotic, churning boil of air, wreckage and oil. The Empress had released her bunkers as she broke apart. The coal dust and the heavy fuel oil rose to the top, creating a thick black slick that coated everything. It coated the wood of the lifeboats. It coated the eyes of the swimmers. It filled the mouths of the dying. In the first few minutes after the ship disappeared, there was a sound that sailors fear more than the wind. It was a collective human sound, a chorus of hundreds of voices screaming in shock, in pain, and in terror. It rose up from the water, muffled by the fog, echoing off the invisible banks of the St. Lawrence. It was the sound of a city drowning. But the river is a cold silencer. The water temperature was barely 40 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, the human body does not last long. The noise began to fade. It didn't stop all at once. It dropped away, voice by voice. The cold acts as an anesthetic. It numbs the skin, then the muscles, then the mind. It makes you feel sleepy. It tells you that it is okay to close your eyes. It tells you that the struggle is too hard and that the water is a soft place to rest. Those who had lifebelts floated like corks, their heads kept above the surface. but their bodies submerged in the freezing current. They huddled together in clusters, grabbing onto anything that floated. Deck chairs, crates, wooden gratings. They grabbed onto each other. In the water, status dissolved. There was no first class. There was no third class. There was only the living and the dead. A wealthy merchant from Montreal clung to the same piece of wreckage as a stoker from the boiler room. The oil covered them both, erasing their clothes, erasing their faces, turning them into identical shivering statues. Captain Kendall was there. The man who had commanded the ship, who had stood on the high bridge, was now treading water in the dark. He had been pulled down by the suction of the sinking ship, dragged deep into the river, before his life vest shot him back to the surface. He found a wooden grate. He pulled himself onto it. He was freezing. He was in shock. But the instinct of command is a hard thing to kill. Even there, floating on a raft of debris, he tried to organize. He called out. He tried to direct the few lifeboats that were visible in the gloom. But the chaos was absolute. The Storstad, the ship that had delivered the fatal blow, was drifting nearby. Her bow was crumpled, her metal twisted, but she was afloat. The collision had happened so fast and the fog was so thick that her crew barely understood the magnitude of what they had done. They heard the screams. They knew something terrible had happened. But the Empress was gone. She wasn't just sinking, she had vanished. The Storstad lowered her boats. It was a clumsy, desperate operation. These were men who moved coal, not rescue workers, but they rowed into the dark. They rowed toward the sound of the voices. What they found was a nightmare. The water was thick with bodies. The boats had to navigate through a carpet of humanity. The oars struck soft objects in the water. The sailors reached down, grabbing wrists, grabbing collars, hauling people over the gunwales. They pulled them in until the boats were dangerously low in the water. They piled the survivors on top of each other. The living lay on the dead. The warm blood of the injured mixed with the freezing river water and the black oil. But for many, the rescue came too late. They were pulled from the water alive only to die on the floorboards of the lifeboat minutes later. The cold had already reached their hearts, and while this tragedy played out on the surface, a different, quieter horror was happening 130 feet below. The wreck of the Empress had settled on the bottom. She lay on her starboard side. The mud of the riverbed rose up to meet her, swallowing the lower cabins. We must consider the physics of the sinking. The ship went down so fast that not all the air could escape. It was trapped in pockets, in cabins, in pantries, in the ends of corridors that were now sealed by water. It is a terrifying certainty that not everyone died when the ship went under. There were those who were trapped in air pockets. They were dry or partially dry. They were in the dark. They were under immense pressure. Imagine sitting on a bunk in a cabin that is now tilted on its side, deep underwater. The air is foul. The pressure makes your ears pop. You can hear the groaning of the steel as the ship settles. You can hear the river shifting outside the hull. You are alive, but you are buried in a tomb of steel. There is no way out. The pressure of the water against the door is tons per square inch. You cannot open it. You can only wait. You wait for the air to run out. You wait for the water to find a way in. Or you wait for the carbon dioxide to put you to sleep. We do not know how many survived the initial plunge only to die in the dark hours later. The river keeps that secret. But divers who visited the wreck later would find evidence of frantic attempts to escape. Scratches on the ceilings. Port lights smashed from the inside. It is a silence that screams. Back on the surface, the fog began to lift. It was a slow reveal. The sun was coming up. The grey curtain that had hidden the disaster began to thin, torn apart by the morning breeze. The light revealed the scale of the loss. The river was empty. The great liner was gone. In its place was a debris field that stretched for miles downstream. The rescue ships arrived. The Eureka, the Lady Evelyn. They were pilot boats and mail tenders that had raced from Rimouski when the SOS signal was heard. They steamed into a scene of desolation. They found the lifeboats from the Storstad overloaded, drifting. They found the few lifeboats from the Empress that had launched. And they found the bodies, hundreds of them. They bobbed in the current, held up by their life jackets. They looked like sleepers. Their heads were tipped back, eyes closed, faces pale as wax. The oil gave them a uniform, ghostly appearance. The crews of the rescue ships worked in grim silence. They used boat hooks. They leaned over the rails, grabbing the clothing of the dead, hauling them aboard. It became a harvest. They stacked the bodies on the decks, row after row, men, women, children. The sheer number of them overwhelmed the senses. There were not enough tarps to cover them. They lay under the morning sun, staring up at a sky that was indifferent to their fate. The survivors were taken to Rimouski. Rimouski is a small town on the south shore of the St. Lawrence. It was a quiet place, a place of fishermen and farmers. That morning it became a morgue. The ships docked at the wharf. The survivors walked off, those who could walk. They were wrapped in blankets, shivering, their eyes hollow. They were barefoot. Some were naked, having stripped off their heavy wet clothes in the water. They were covered in oil. They looked like creatures from another world. The townspeople rushed to help. They brought clothes, they brought hot soup, they opened their homes. But then came the dead. There were too many for the local undertakers. There were too many for the hospital. They opened the sheds on the wharf, the long wooden warehouses usually used for storing lumber and grain. They laid the bodies out on the floor. It was an arithmetic of loss. Counting, sorting, identifying. The Salvation Army band, the one that had played hymns on the deck, was almost entirely wiped out. Their instruments were at the bottom of the river, and their bodies were laid out in the shed. Families walked the rows. It was a procession of heartbreak. A husband looking for a wife, a mother looking for a child. They looked at the faces, wiping away the oil and the coal dust, hoping not to recognize the features and yet terrified of never finding them. The silence in that shed was heavier than the silence of the river. It was the silence of a future that had been erased. Among the survivors, stories began to emerge, fragments of the 14 minutes that had destroyed their lives. There was the story of the doctor, Dr. Grant. He had been in his cabin when the crash occurred. He had tried to go up, but the list was too severe. He was trapped. The ship went down, taking him with it. He described the sensation of the water hitting him, the darkness, the crushing pressure. He was in a corridor, water rushing around him. He took a breath, the last breath he thought he would ever take, and then a miracle of physics. The ship, as it hit the bottom, expelled a massive bubble of air. It was a burp of the dying vessel. Dr. Grant was caught in it. He was shot out of the ship, through a funnel or a ventilator shaft, ejected like a cork from a champagne bottle. He broke the surface, gasping, alive. He was one of the few who went down with the ship and returned. But for every Dr. Grant, there were hundreds who did not return. There was the story of the parents who held their children, only to have the force of the water rip them from their arms. The guilt of the survivor is a heavy burden. Why me? Why did I let go? These questions would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The news traveled the world by telegraph. Empress of Ireland sinking. Total loss. Thousands feared dead. It hit the headlines with the force of a physical blow. The world was still recovering from the Titanic. That wound had barely healed. And now, this. But there was a difference. The Titanic had taken hours to sink. There had been time for music, for heroism, for the slow realization of fate. The Empress had been a slaughter. It was sudden, violent, mechanical. It felt unfair. It felt cheap. A collision in a river, within sight of land, with a ship that stayed afloat. It didn't have the tragic grandeur of the iceberg. It had the gritty, industrial reality of a traffic accident, and the numbers were damning. On the Titanic, the loss of life was staggering. But on the Empress, the percentage of passengers lost was even higher. Of the 1,477 people on board, 1,012 died. 1,012. Think of the children. There were 138 children on the Empress. Only 4 survived. 4. The river took the future. It took the next generation. In the days that followed, the recovery continued. Divers were sent down. Hard-hat divers in heavy canvas suits with brass helmets, dragging air hoses behind them. They descended into the green twilight of the river. The current was strong at the bottom. The visibility was poor. They found the ship lying on her side. She looked huge in the gloom, a sleeping giant. But she was not peaceful. The divers reported seeing bodies everywhere, caught in the rigging, trapped against the railings, looking out from the portholes. It was a sight that broke even the hardest men. They were not salvaging gold. They were harvesting the dead. They brought them up one by one. The baskets were lowered, the bodies were strapped in. The surface crews would pull them up. The water sluicing off the canvas bags, revealing the human shape inside. It was a grim assembly line, and all the while the questions began to mount. How? How could two ships, equipped with modern technology, in a river that was wide and deep, simply run into each other? The public wanted a villain. They wanted someone to blame. Was it Captain Kendall, the man who survived while his passengers died? Was it Captain Anderson of the Storstad, the Norwegian whose ship became a knife? Was it the fog? The inquiry that followed would try to dissect the 14 minutes. They would analyze the angles, the whistles, the steering orders. They would try to impose logic on chaos. But standing on the docks of Rimouski, looking at the rows of coffins, logic felt useless. The arithmetic of loss is a cold phrase. It suggests that you can subtract the survivors from the passengers and get a result. But the result is not a number. The result is a void, a space in a family photo, a silence at a dinner table, a name that is never spoken again without a tremor in the voice. The Empress of Ireland did not just sink a ship, she sank a community. The bodies were loaded onto trains, the funeral trains. They chugged slowly out of Rimouski, heading for Quebec City, for Montreal, for Toronto. As they passed through the countryside, people stood by the tracks. They took off their hats. They bowed their heads. It was a cortege of steel and steam, carrying the victims of steel and steam. The river flowed on. The St. Lawrence is indifferent to grief. It is a geological force, not a moral one. It covered the wreck with silt. It washed away the oil. It hid the scars. But for those who stood on the banks, for those who waited for the trains, the river had changed. It was no longer just water. It was a boundary, a threshold between the living and the lost. And the fog still comes, even today. If you stand on the shore near Pointe-au-Père, where the lighthouse still stands watch, you can see it form. It rolls in, thick and silent. It erases the horizon. And if you listen closely, really closely, you can almost hear it. The low, mournful blast of a whistle, the sound of a collision, and the silence that follows. The silence that holds 1,000 names. In the weeks that followed, the silence of the river was replaced by the scratch of pens and the rustle of paper. The tragedy moved from the water to the courtroom. It moved from the realm of physics to the realm of law. They convened the inquiry in Quebec City. It was a grand affair, presided over by Lord Mersey. He was a man of the empire, a figure of stern judicial authority. He had been the man who presided over the inquiry into the Titanic just 2 years before. He was becoming the coroner of the Atlantic. The room was packed. Journalists, lawyers, survivors, and the ghosts of the dead filled the gallery. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool and stale tobacco. Maps were pinned to the walls, diagrams of the river, blueprints of the ship. It was an attempt to impose order on chaos, to take 14 minutes of terror and dissect them second by second to find the truth. But truth, like the river, is fluid. Captain Kendall took the stand. He looked older. The ordeal had etched lines into his face. He spoke with the quiet conviction of a man who believes he followed the rules. He swore that he had stopped his ship. He swore that the Storstad had altered course. He swore that he was the victim of a reckless maneuver by the other vessel. Then came the crew of the Storstad. They were rougher men, Norwegians, speaking through translators. They told a different story. They swore that the Empress had been moving. They swore that she had cut across their bow. They claimed they had held their course until the very last moment. It was a Rashomon effect played out in maritime law. 2 ships, 2 captains, 2 contradictory realities. The lawyers argued over angles. They argued over whistle blasts. They brought in experts to talk about currents and momentum. They turned the screaming and the dying into vectors and velocity. But no amount of legal argument could answer the fundamental question that hung over the room. How? How, in an era of wireless telegraphy, of watertight bulkheads, of rigid safety protocols, did a modern liner sink in 14 minutes? The inquiry eventually laid the blame on the Storstad. They ruled that the collier had changed course in the fog, a fatal error of judgment. It was a convenient verdict. It protected the reputation of the Canadian Pacific Railway. It protected the prestige of the British merchant navy. But it didn't explain the speed. The speed was the terrifying part. The Titanic had taken 2 hours and 40 minutes to die. She had given the world time to understand what was happening. The Empress had been an execution. The engineers testified quietly. They spoke of longitudinal bulkheads versus transverse bulkheads. They spoke of buoyancy and metacentric height. They revealed a hard truth. The Empress was designed to survive a collision, but she was designed to survive it upright. She was built on the assumption that she would take on water, but stay level. The Storstad had struck her in the worst possible place, at the worst possible angle. The damage had caused that immediate violent list, and once the ship leaned, the safety features became liabilities. The open portholes, hundreds of them, became intake valves. The longitudinal bulkheads, meant to contain water, instead trapped it on one side, pulling the ship over like a capsizing canoe. The system hadn't failed because it broke. It failed because it worked exactly as designed, but in a scenario the designers hadn't anticipated. It was a lesson in humility. We build our machines to conquer nature, but nature only needs to find one flaw, one variable we didn't calculate, to bring them down. The inquiry closed. The lawyers packed their briefcases. The journalists filed their stories. And then, history played its cruelest trick. If the Empress of Ireland had sunk in 1912, she would be as famous as the Titanic. She would be a legend. But she sank in May of 1914. 2 months later, in Sarajevo, an archduke was assassinated. The world held its breath. The dominoes of alliance and treaty began to fall. By August, the guns of Europe were firing. The Great War had begun. The headlines changed overnight. The names of the drowned passengers were replaced by the names of battles. The sinking of a single ship, however tragic, was eclipsed by the slaughter of millions. The Empress of Ireland was pushed off the front page. She was pushed out of the public conversation. She was pushed into the shadows. Who mourns 1,000 dead when the world is mourning a generation? The wreck lay forgotten on the bottom of the St. Lawrence. The war raged on. Captain Kendall, the survivor, went to sea again. He served in the war. He survived torpedoes. He survived the Atlantic convoys. He was a man who could not be killed by the ocean, but he carried the ghost of the Empress with him until his dying day. The river kept the ship. Down there in the cold and the dark, time moves differently. The St. Lawrence is freshwater mostly. It is cold. It lacks the wood-eating worms that devour ships in the deep ocean. The Titanic is being eaten by rust. It is collapsing on itself, returning to the elements. The Empress of Ireland is waiting. If you were to go down there today, and you can if you are a diver of immense skill and courage, you would find her. She is not a pile of debris. She is a ship. She lies on her starboard side, buried deep in the silt. The current is fierce. The water is pitch black. You need powerful lights to see anything. But when the beam cuts through the gloom, she appears. You can see the teak decking still intact after a century. You can see the letters on the bow. You can see the promenade where the band played. It is a tomb that has been perfectly preserved. Divers have brought up artifacts, a bell, a compass, a child's doll. But they have also left things behind. Inside the hull, inside the tangled wreckage of the cabins, there are bones. The river has buried them in mud, hiding them from view. But they are there. The wreck is a dangerous place. It has claimed the lives of divers who ventured too deep, who got lost in the labyrinth of corridors, who underestimated the silt that swirls up to blind them. It is as if the ship is still claiming victims, guarding her privacy with a jealous rage. Inside the cargo holds, the silver bullion she was carrying was salvaged decades ago. Men blew holes in the hull to get to the purser's safe and the mailroom. They took the gold and the silver. But the real treasure is the story, and that is harder to extract. The Empress sits there as a monument to a lost age. The Edwardian era died on that ship, as much as it did in the trenches of France. It was the end of the belief that technology made us safe. It was the end of the idea that class and money could protect you from the elements. On the surface, the legacy is quieter. After the disaster, the rules changed, but they changed quietly. The Empress Clause was written into maritime law. It stated that watertight doors must be closed before entering fog, not after the collision. It seems like common sense now. It was written in blood then. They changed the design of ships' bows, they changed the rules of the road for river navigation. Every time you step onto a ferry or a cruise ship, and you see the safety videos or hear the captain warn of turbulence, you are hearing the echo of the Empress. Her death brought safety for the millions who came after. But her name is not on our lips. We remember the Titanic because it is a story of hubris, it is a Greek tragedy. The unsinkable ship, the band playing on. It fits a narrative we understand. The Empress of Ireland is a story of chaos, of bad luck, of a mistake made in a cloud. It is uncomfortable. It reminds us that death doesn't always have a meaning. Sometimes it just happens. Sometimes the fog comes down and the world ends in 14 minutes. There is a museum now at Pointe-au-Père. The lighthouse is still there, a sentinel watching over the graveyard. Inside the museum there are shoes. That is what strikes you the most. The shoes. Leather boots, delicate evening slippers, tiny shoes that belong to toddlers. The bodies decompose, the clothes rot away, but the leather of the shoes survives the water. They are pulled from the wreck, still laced, still shaped by the feet that wore them. They sit in glass cases. They are the most human artifacts imaginable. You can look at a pair of workman's boots and see the shape of his stride. You can see the wear on the heel. You can imagine him standing on the deck, smoking a pipe, looking at the lights of Quebec, thinking about home, and then the water. These shoes walked the decks. They ran down the tilting corridors. They kicked against the water. And then they settled into the mud. They are the footprints of the lost. If you go to the shoreline today, the St. Lawrence looks much as it did in 1914. It is vast, it is beautiful, and it is indifferent. The huge container ships pass by, monsters of steel that dwarf the Empress. They carry electronics, cars, grain. They move with radar, with GPS, with satellite navigation. They can see through the fog. They can see around corners. The captains on the bridges of these modern giants drink their coffee and watch their screens. They are safe. But if the fog rolls in, a prudent captain will still feel a chill. They know what lies beneath their keel. They know that down there in the crushing dark lies a reminder of what happens when we get too comfortable. The Empress of Ireland is not just a wreck. She is a warning. She whispers that the margin between safety and disaster is razor thin. She whispers that time is not on our side. She whispers that no matter how much steel we build, how many rivets we drive, how many watertight doors we install, we are still guests on the water. And the water always wins in the end. 14 minutes. That is the number to keep in your mind. It is the time it takes to say goodbye. It is the time it takes to realize that everything you thought was permanent is temporary. As the sun sets over the river, casting that long golden light across the grey water, the buoy that marks the wreck site bobs gently in the current. It is a small marker for such a massive grave. But the river remembers. The river holds the shape of the hull in its bed. It holds the silence of the cabins. It holds the dreams of the immigrants who never made it to shore. The Titanic belongs to the world. It belongs to Hollywood. It belongs to myth. The Empress of Ireland belongs to the river. And there, in the cold embrace of the St. Lawrence, she sleeps. A grand ambition, a violent end, a quiet legacy, and a story that once heard is impossible to forget.